Uh, Good morning, everyone. I know it's only 9:30 a.m., but hopefully everyone's awake. And my name is Arielle Davidson. I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Middle East and International Law. It's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to our spring conference, Settlers in Syria, Turkish Population Transfers in International Law. I'd like to start by just saying, the importance of an event like this is really to bring attention to what is a humanitarian crisis in northern Syria that I think many of the panelists would agree when I say this has not received nearly the amount of international attention and reprimand that it probably should, or it most certainly should. And there are a tremendous number of cultural, political, and legal implications as a result of what's occurring right now in northern Syria. As we know, the Syrian civil war has been raging on for over a decade. And during that time, Turkey has been facilitating the relocation of thousands of Syrian Arabs into Afrin and the M4 Strip. These are areas that were previously inhabited by the Kurds and the Yazidis for the most part. And this rearrangement of the country will have, again, implications, very strong ones in the coming decades. I'd also like to invite the director of the center, Professor Eugene Kodorovich, to make a few comments before we dive into our first panel of the morning, which is the policy panel that will be moderated by Sally Al-Ghazali. So Eugene, I'm going to let you chime in and add any additional comments you would like before we begin.
Great. Thank you so much, Arielle, for organizing this conference, and thank you to Sally for hosting the first panel. And thank you very much to all of our speakers for participating in this important event, and to everyone who is watching and will be watching subsequently the recording. So I want to say just a few words. This event's hosted by the Center for the Middle East and International Law at George Mason University Scalia Law School. And we're dedicated to looking at legal issues that arise throughout the Middle East that often don't get enough attention, or bringing different perspectives to issues that have gotten considerable attention, and looking them through other methodological lenses. The center has a largely positivist bent, simply because I'm a positivist, and what that means, I think, may come out in the panel, in the legal panel. But this is a really prime example of what the center is trying to do, because if, for example, you look at the International Committee on the Red Cross's Guide to State Practice under International Law, which is an extraordinarily well-researched and important and authoritative handbook, they have maybe 5 pages and over 100 examples of state practice regarding Article 49.6, but none relate to this particular practice, and information on it is hard to come by. So we hope to shed more light on it and to find out what it means both in the region as a policy matter and what it means for international law. Thank you all for joining us, and over to you, Arielle.
Thanks, Eugene. And now I'm going to introduce our first moderator, who's Sally Al-Ghazali. She is a 2022 JD candidate at George Mason University's Law School. And she's actually right now a visiting student at Georgetown University. She has a wide background and expertise in international law, and she actually has a unique perspective on the Middle East, being Iraqi herself. She was born in Baghdad, Iraq, and she lived in Jordan for almost a decade after that. And then she eventually settled in the United States following her time in Jordan. She herself actually runs a research blog called The Human Rights Weekly, and which basically addresses human rights violations worldwide. And she is also currently the editor-in-chief of the George Mason International Law Journal. She is working as an international trade law clerk at Clark Hill in Washington, D.C., where she will be following her graduation. So we'll be sad to lose Sally eventually, but she has a very bright future ahead. So Sally, I will let you take over moderating the first panel.
Thank you so much, Arielle, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning again. As Arielle and Professor Kantorovich said, we have 2 panels today, And the main thing that we want to do in this webinar is to discuss the legal implication behind Turkey's displacement and relocation efforts in Afrin and M4 strips. But we're not able to answer that question before we discuss and explore the political, cultural, and policy motives behind these relocation efforts. So in order to do that, we decided to discuss these matters in the first panel, and we have a great panelist with us today to discuss the matters in hand from the policy panel. And I'm going to do a brief introduction on the panelists before we dive into the comments that they have to provide on this topic. Starting with Professor Ryan Ganaras. He's a professor at the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School and is an expert on Turkish, Balkan, and Middle East history. He is the author of 4 books, including most recently, Fall of the Sultan, Great War, and the End of the Ottoman Empire, 1908 to 1922. He has participated in a wide variety of research and education projects on behalf of the Department of State, Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense. He also speaks German, Spanish, Turkish fluently, and possesses working knowledge in Albanian and Macedonian. Next, we have Dr. Kurt Werthmüller. He's a supervisory policy analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, with a particular emphasis on religious freedom in Egypt and Levant. Before joining the commission, he was an associate professor for Middle Eastern Studies at the American University in Dubai, where he taught medieval and modern Eastern history as well as regional, political, and culture. He is the author of Coptic Identity and Ayyubid Politics in Egypt, as well as many short-form scholarly works on regional topics. He received his PhD in Islamic and Middle Eastern history from University of California, Santa Barbara, and Master's in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. And lastly, we have Dr. Eddie Cohen. He is a historian and commentator currently serving as a researcher at the Bijan Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. He previously served as a postdoctoral research fellow at Bar Ilan University, Menachem Begin Center for the Study of Resistant Movements. Dr. Cohen also specializes in inter-Arab relations and Arab-Israeli conflict. He was born and raised in Lebanon. Dr. Cohen was eventually forced to flee Israel due to anti-Semitic violence. He earned his PhD in Middle Eastern history at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and he also authored many articles and several books, including his most recent, The Mufti and the Jews. So thank you all for joining us today and providing your insight on this topic. I'm now going to allow you to provide your comments on this topic before I ask you a question about the matter, and then open the question for the attendees to ask questions as well. Professor Ryan, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak this morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just sort of make 2 quick programming notes. Number one, it's a little early here and it's spring break, so if a child or a dog does barge in, please accept my apologies preemptively. The second is that I'm required to state sort of at the front that what I'm about to present is my opinions. These are my views. They don't reflect Navy or DoD. Now, in any case, what I wanted to try to accomplish this morning in support of this event is to give a little bit of historical background into Turkish policy regarding the Syrian border in particular. And I should say somewhat generally, what I hope to do is sort of leave this topic, relatively up to the point of the Syrian civil war, although I'll sort of give you a few of my ideas about the nature of Turkish policy in the region as it stands now, in the border region as it stands now. Okay, so I thought the best way to think about this topic that we're going to be talking about today was to look at the issue of the occupation from the question of permanence. How should we think about the occupation? How should we think about the Turkish presence within Syria today? One way I think I would best be able to help is by talking about this Turkish policy from the perspective of the past. Because in many ways, one could look at Turkish policies in places like Jarablus and Afrin as a response to contemporary challenges. But in reality, the Turkish government, going back a very long period of time, has been thinking and struggling with the question of its southern border in many different ways, in particular from a question of security. And where I would like to sort of leave off is that it's still somewhat difficult to say how permanent the Turkish presence is in northern Syria. Things can go in lots of different ways. But perhaps the best way to think about, among the main pressures that may guide Turkish policy in the region is both the legacies or kind of continuous sort of internal pressures regarding the need to solve what is a historic security problem, but also the issue of irredentism as a force within Turkish policy and Turkish politics. Okay, so I'm going to start, my discussion sort of begin first in trying to set this problem up by talking about the history of this region, at least a little bit briefly. The first and foremost thing that one should understand about the region of Turkey's border with Syria is that it is entirely historically recent. Now, even though the region is very much devastated demographically, it's devastated physically, it's devastated economically as a result of the First World War and conflicts immediately thereafter, the Turkish government in particular continued to have certain anxieties about the demographic composition of this region, as well as certain anxieties about the security of the southern border. Now, among the many things that it attempted to do was try to demographically re-engineer the region. And again, I can go into greater details what that would entail, but in terms of the broad strokes, it entailed not only the placement of or the settling of various groups not native to the region along the border, as well as relatively invasive policies related to trying to suppress quote unquote non-Turkish culture. Okay, or the sort of the historic nature of the security problem as it's defined by Ankara in the region, and some of the different ways that Ankara has tried to tackle this security problem. Now, going back to 1923, the founding of the Republic of Turkey, it was generally understood that the border of itself posed a challenge, like all borders, not only in terms of trying to regulate traffic, but also maintain some sort of physical security for the communities that reside within it. And this is obviously further heightened by this policy of Turkification or social reengineering that we see post-1923. Now, these endeavors were beset by, again, lots of different challenges. One of the most fundamental is the flowing of people back and forth. Many of the communities along the border were actually historically tied to one another, and from the Turkish side to the Syrian side to the Turkish side. And these ties are not only economic; many of them are actually personal. That historically, many of the big market towns on the Turkish side historically had relatives or had historic business interests or even cultural ties to communities on the south side of the border, most principally in Aleppo. So just the simple flow of people back and forth was seen as being, in and of itself, problematic. More specific to this was the question of smuggling. Now, this is linked to a broader sort of story about Turkey's economic development. But Turkey, since 1923, has long tried to tightly regulate trade, both trade into Turkey, trade out of Turkey, along the Syrian border. Now, local communities, going back from virtually the conception of this border, largely resisted any type of restriction on the movement of goods. And this would come in terms of goods that are everyday goods that in which there were embargoes placed upon it, or certain amounts of constraints placed upon it, again, flowing both out as well as in, as well as illegal commodities, most notably various derivatives of opium. Now, this this issue of illicit economic activity also was seen as linked to militancy. Now, again, trying to save sort of the broader details, and I'm more than happy to go into it in any kind of Q&A. it's very clear that from the 1920s all the way up really to the present, communities on the south side of the border, on the Syrian side, has long harbored people who were political dissidents political dissidents towards Turkish policy. Now, most notably, this dissidents are associated with Kurdish nationalists. In fact, among the earliest Kurdish uprisings to rack Turkey during the 1920s was organized from regions along the border on the Syrian side. There are also sort of other historic dissident communities, although many of these communities have since vanished or become relatively, small, over time. At various points, there were large numbers of Armenians that lived along various border communities. Armenians who were either themselves the victims or the descendants of the Armenian genocide. Now, it should be said that Ankara has long been very conscious of this region and its contribution to militant activity within Turkey, and saw this as somewhat intertwined with the broader economic challenges of trying to constrain or regulate the flow of goods in and out. And so we have actually a really good documentary body of evidence that shows that Turkey, the Turkish government really has labored over the course of many decades to try to tamp down on the border, not just for its reasons of nationalizing the country, again, this idea of social reengineering or Turkification, but also trying to constrain this, this region for reasons of economic concerns, regions of security concerns. I'll just again point out to you that on the top of your screen, you're seeing a brief clip or a sort of small screenshot. It's tried issuing, for example, one of the earliest things that they've tried was to create a kind of migratory, bilateral migratory system that would allow border residents to go back and forth. This was specifically the case of semi-nomadic groups that lived along the border. But oftentimes, the Turkish policy has been rather hard-nosed. At various points, the border was mined. More recently, Ankara has put up a wall, a very long concrete wall, which you'll see here on the bottom right of your screen, as a way of trying to deter traffic. Needless to say, not all of these issues have proven very effective. In fact, again, the clip here, the little screenshot that you see here on the top right, demonstrate that even at the time in which the wall that was constructed existed, you had thousands of people who are being arrested on the Turkish side of the border virtually every day for illicit entry into Turkey. Now, this brings me to the issue of irredentism. Now, very briefly, without going into a longer history of the hows and why irredentist politics exists in Turkey, suffice to say that going back again to the founding of the Turkish Republic, there has always been dissident voices within Ankara itself, as well as within society at large, who have contended that Turkey's borders are illegitimate for the simple fact that there are communities outside of the border that should be within the Turkish state. And that, for one reason or another, Turkey has been forced to abandon lands that should be a part of it, should be a part of the Turkish nation state. Now, this is in particularly the case for lands within Syria, including a large city like Aleppo, that irredentists and many of these irredentists coming from Turkey's far right or sort of more extreme portions of the Turkish right-wing spectrum have maintained that the border that, as it exists now, excludes thousands of Turkish speakers who should be inside the Turkish state. That the Turkish border should include them within the Turkish state. Now, it should be said that the irredentism in Turkey has really surged within the last decade or so. It's always sort of been in the background, although it never has quite featured as prominently as it has done today. And this is largely a result of electoral politics. More specifically, the decision in 2016 by Recep Tayyip Erdogan to form an electoral alliance with the far-right party, the MHP. Now, we could say that, when we look at Turkish policy today, but more importantly, how Turkish policy has come to resonate within electoral politics, it's really difficult to separate these irredentist tendencies from the broader policy itself, especially around the time of the first Turkish incursions into Syria. It's very clear that this kind of irredentism had a really electrifying effect on the Turkish right, most notably among those who are voters or supporters of the MHP. Now, when we look at the policy from the perspective of today of Turkish occupation in northern Syria, we should try to understand it not only as a state policy, but also as a policy that has mobilized NGOs, as well as everyday citizens to not only back the incursions, but to play a role within the occupation itself. So, for example, on the bottom right of your screen, you see a bus that was organized by an ultra-right nationalist organization to deliver aid to communities on in occupied zones within Syria, most notably within communities that are Turkish speakers. So, added to this was the desire to kind of aid Turks, or Turks living in northern Syria within the occupied zones. Among the things that also really electrified the Turkish right as a result of the incursions was the fact that the fight was being brought to Kurdish militants, to the PKK within Syria itself. Now, Turkey's incursions since 2016 do reflect a broader pattern of militancy, or sort of a militant response to PKK activity within Syria. But this was really the first time that the Turkish state had finally kind of broken the seal and marched south into Syria, not only to combat the PKK, but actually to take territory away from Kurdish militants. I think the most conservative way of thinking about it is that perhaps we should think about the Turkish occupation as temporary or tactical. That at the very least, we may see a Turkish presence there that may withdraw as a result of some sort of peace agreement. And that even though we may see expressions of permanence within the region, and I'm sure other speakers today will speak to that, specifically the movement of populations to the region, this may be a sign that Turkey is trying to manage this occupation as best it can with the limited resources it can, and that perhaps over time it would be willing to relinquish the territory, but also allow these territories to resume some sort of semblance of whatever complexion they had before. I mean, it is also very, very likely that this is a sign of a longer occupation, and that the changes wrought by the Turkish occupation are intended to be permanent. And speaking in favor of that are these long-term historical trends that Turkey has long struggled to try to maintain this region, to maintain security in this region, try to manage the region, and has done so unsuccessfully from its historic side of the border. And so, in short, the occupation in some ways is seen as a historic correction, or perhaps an opportunity to permanently fix the security environment, the economic environment, the cultural environment in a way that suits it and that conforms to its long-term intention. Okay, so I'm going to close there. I thank you, everybody, for your attention. If you have any questions, please do. I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, please do email me with your questions. And again, thank you for the invitation. And I look forward to the rest of the panels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ryan, for the very insightful presentation. Dr. Ruth Miller, you can have the floor now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As Sally mentioned in her kind introduction, my name is Kurt Worthmuller, and I'm a supervisory policy analyst with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. We're an independent, bipartisan U.S. government agency that monitors and assesses religious freedom abroad using international standards and makes recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. It's my privilege to speak with you all today on the policy implications of population transfers in northern Syria, in, of course, the excellent company of this panel of experts. I'd like to first thank the Scalia Law School and, of course, organizers with the Center for the Middle East and International Law, Sally for moderating, Ariel for organizing, Eugene for conceiving of and launching this event. And this is particularly the case as the world's attention in early 22 has, perhaps understandably, been centered on Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. As we know from other conflicts in our time, authoritarian regimes often use such distractions to intensify their perpetration of atrocities when they perceive that no one is watching. So in this case, we must assure that even as we rightly condemn Russia's operations in Ukraine, we also maintain a spotlight on other areas, such as Syria, in which people continue to suffer 11 long years into its conflict. And that spotlight applies to the brutality of the Assad regime, to the radical Islamist control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham over Idlib, and, apropos of our emphasis today, to Turkey's destructive occupation of a wide band of territory inside Syria's northern border. USCIRF has closely followed the horrific events of the Syrian conflict since it first evolved into a civil war following the regime's repression of a peaceful grassroots uprising in 2011. And we have, in fact, called for the country's designation as a country of particular concern, or CPC, for systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations every year since 2014. Those violations apply to the Assad regime, but they also apply to a whole array of state and non-state actors who have played a role in destroying Syrian lives. And that background brings me to the crux of my remarks today, the particular implications for U.S. religious freedom policy of population transfers in northern Syria, and of the religious and ethnic cleansing that has allowed such resettlement to take place. First, I'd like to recognize that conflict zones such as Syria often present a unique challenge in terms of discerning between violence that inevitably results from conflict and the sort of state repression that specifically targets religious freedom and other essential human rights. And yet we can and we must discern as such, including recognizing that radical Islamist non-state actors such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, Jabhat al-Nusra, and ISIS before it, have made life unbearable for religious and ethnic minorities in areas under their control. We at USCIRF have been recommending since 2018 that the United States designate HTS as an entity of particular concern for its own egregious abuses of religious freedom in Idlib province. And we've been pleased to welcome the State Department's EPC designation of HTS for the last 2 years. However, we must also continue to reiterate the essential fact that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and the corrupt system that surrounds him are uniquely culpable in causing and perpetrating the massive 11-year humanitarian disaster of this conflict. It is an inescapable fact that the Assad regime has cynically used the conflict to tighten its ideological grip on religious life in the country, such as taking steps to progressively deepen its control of Sunni Islamic institutions as recently as last year. And throughout the conflict, and indeed for decades, it has done its best to weave a false narrative that it alone stands to protect religious minorities. Its hypocrisy has been evident, of course, in its willingness earlier in the war to destroy churches during its recapture of Aleppo and elsewhere, and it's been evident in other ways that are less dramatic but no less important, such as its announcement in December 2020 that it would continue to identify Yazidis who are still struggling to recover from the ISIS genocide and repeated displacement, not as members of a distinct religious community, with their own identity and traditions, but as Sunni Muslims. Yusuf has not forgotten the ongoing role that the Assad regime has played in obliterating the human rights of Syrians writ large, including their essential freedom of religion or belief and all that it should entail. But the horrific impact of internal and external forces on religious freedom in Syria is also clearly evident in the country's northern reaches, where Turkey invaded and occupied territory in March 2018 and expanded into a wider swath of control in November 2019. Thanks to the useful documents that today's events organizers have already circulated among participants, I don't need to recap all of these events, but suffice to say that the Turkish armed forces and Turkish-backed Syrian opposition groups, or TSOs, I'm from a government agency, so I need to throw in acronyms whenever possible. They've represented the driving force behind an unmistakable effort to cleanse the area of its long heritage of religious and ethnic diversity. The religious freedom policy implications of this situation are clear. As we have reported unflinchingly since 2019, Turkey's incessant shelling and drone strikes on civilian areas across northern Syria and the potential for expansion of its occupation have represented a direct threat to religious and ethnic minorities in those communities. And its support for radical Islamist TSOs has been equally insidious and damaging, as such groups have engaged in religious violence, abduction for ransom, and other atrocities. For example, in 2020, Felak Hashem, a TSO operating in the area of Afrin, laid siege to the town of Besafan and arrested and tortured a number of its inhabitants, including at least one Yazidi woman. This militia and others have also defaced or destroyed a series of Yazidi shrines in the same area and across Turkey's occupation zone, while Syriac, Armenian, and other Christian communities too face similar threats. Ironically, the start of this process of religious and ethnic cleansing represented a merging of insidious aims between Turkey and the Assad regime. The former launched its cynically named Operation Olive Branch, which devastated the religious and ethnic diversity of Afrin only weeks before the regime regained control over the Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta. Its forces subsequently displaced droves of Sunni Arab families from that area in retaliation for their perceived disloyalty, and most of them fled north, where Turkey and its allied militias facilitated their resettlement into newly abandoned communities in and around Afrin. In other words, Turkey and its allied militias are no less culpable than the regime in assuring that Afrin and a whole string of towns across Syria's northern border region have become inhospitable, intolerant places for those religious and ethnic minorities whose family have called the area home for generation upon generation. Yusuf has been grateful to see the Biden administration recognize the destructive role that TSOs play in this context. We've recommended for several years that the United States levy targeted sanctions against the worst religious freedom violators among those armed groups. And in 2021, the administration placed such sanctions against TSO Ahrar al-Sharqiyya and its leaders Abu Hatem Shakra and Abu Jafar Shakra, rightly placing them in such infamous company as HTS and other gross violators of human rights and religious freedom. Yusuf continues to call for the expansion of targeted sanctions to all such violators in that area, even as we have also continued to call on the administration to take a firm stance against Turkey's ongoing occupation and abuses, either direct or through proxy forces in northern Syria. Finally, one of the central policy conundrums that inevitably emerges from the complicated Syrian morass is the question of what steps the United States and its international partners can actually take in order to make a constructive difference. In this sense, Yusuf has since 2019 called on successive US administrations to lend support to one of the rare bright spots for religious freedom in Syria under the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, or the AANES. Not only has the AANES explicitly and consistently declared its commitment to religious freedom, but it's worked hard in practice to enact that commitment, despite serious external threats, complicated tribal dynamics across ethnic and religious divides, and other potential barriers. Religious and ethnic minorities who fled from Turkish-controlled areas, Kurds, Assyrians, Armenians, Syriac Christians, Yazidis, and others, have found refuge from the surrounding violence and genuine freedom of religion or belief, many of them for the first time. Some practical religious freedom and other challenges persist in this area, of course, often stemming from the complicated relationship of the autonomous administration's founding constituents with Kurdish nationalism and the sheer fragility of the surrounding circumstances. These challenges include reports of underage conscription and past concerns from the Syriac Christian community regarding school curriculum. But more importantly, they include a persistent and pervasive fear among religious minorities that a resurgence of ISIS, a return of the Assad regime, or the nearby presence of the Turkish army and TSOs could at any time destroy their safe haven. In other words, despite the AANES's concrete efforts toward religious and ethnic inclusiveness, many among its diverse population remain uncertain whether it can remain a safe haven in the years to come. With this tenuous situation in mind, USCIRF continues to call on the Biden administration to not only generally view the AANES as a partner, as it has tacitly done for some time, but to put that partnership into greater action. As we've consistently recommended over the last 2 years, the United States should lift sanctions from AANES territory, and it should recognize the AANES as a legitimate local government, not to impede the territorial sovereignty of Syria, but rather to create for the autonomous administration a meaningful seat at the table of Syria's future. But to ensure that the AANES can remain a viable safe haven for vulnerable religious and ethnic minorities and a regional model for religious freedom, the United States government must reduce its chief existential threat by taking a firm stance on Turkey's withdrawal from Syria and demanding that it rein in those TSOs who have made life unbearable for those few minority communities who remain under their heel. No Syria policy can truly bring an end to the religious and ethnic cleansing of the country's north, or can help to protect the hard-fought freedoms of those in its northeast without addressing such a withdrawal. Thank you again for this opportunity to engage with such an esteemed and knowledgeable panel of experts, and of course for working to keep the sorrows of Syria in the eye of the public and policymakers alike. Thank you so much.
Israeli murder the Palestinians, etc., etc., etc. This is not true. These land are disputed area. These land don't belong to Palestinians. Although we hear every day, the word Israeli settlement. Now my lecture will focus on what happens in Afrin, in these areas. Turkey has built many settlements, dozens of settlements. I will show you. In everyone silent. If you Google it, you don't hear about it. You don't see articles about it. This is the double standard, new double standard that we are facing here. These are new Turkish settlement in Afrin. As I heard before, they spoke about the Turkish invasion in March 2018. Turkey launched Operation Olive Branch in cooperation with Syrian rebel forces. It's cooperation between the Turk and the Syrian rebel forces. As part of the operation, Turkish forces entered northern Syria and occupied the Syrian town of Afrin. 90% of the people that lived in 2018 were Kurds, 90%, maybe more. the Turkish-backed Syrian rebels committed war crimes against Kurdish residents. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that these forces controlled Afrin, kidnapped, raped women, and made many atrocities in this area. Many of the Kurds who resisted were killed, and those surviving were forced to flee, and the Turks took control of the town, of their lands, and of their houses. Today, 2.5 years after the occupation, maybe more, Turkish forces still control Afrin after the ethnic cleansing was carried out upon its Kurdish residents. The town became a mixed Syrian-Turkish town. They changed the demography of this area. They made Arabization of this area. As we know, the Kurdish are Muslims, but they are not Arabs. So the Kurds, unfortunately, during the history, were persecuted by everyone, by the Turkish, by the Arabs, by the Iranian, and they don't have the political lobby or power as Palestinians have. Millions of euros NGO in country in Europe contribute to the Palestinian cause, and they have NGO and think tank, but the Kurds, they don't have it. So now we have a moral duty to shed light about what happens here in this area. One of the countries financing the construction of this settlement is none other than Kuwait. Yes, Kuwait has repeatedly attacked Israel for what it refers as illegal Israeli construction in illegal settlements on the occupied West Bank, Judea and Samaria. As I said, these are disputed areas and don't belong to the Palestinians. The funding for Turkey's illegal occupation is provided by Kuwait directly, but Kuwait is not the only supporter. Working hand in hand with Kuwait and the Turks, and also there is an Israel-Arab non-profit organization, Live with Dignity, Lechyot B'Kavod, which is entirely funded by donations from Arabs in Israel. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights further noted that the Turkish government continues its effort to change the demography of Afrin canton by establishing a new village for Syrian refugees. With the support of a Kuwaiti Palestinian association known as Sham al-Khair. These are, ladies and gentlemen, a village. It's written in Arabic, Qaryat Kuwait al-Rahma, the village Rahma of Kuwait. Al-Rahma is the name of the who contribute the money, the Kuwaiti Association. And as you see downstairs in the right, the flag of the Syrian rebels and the flag of Turkey. These settlements, ladies and gentlemen, are built on Kurdish lands. This is Syria. Yes, it's Syria, but it's Kurdish land owned by Kurdish people in order to investigate how this Afrin, a Kurdish city, become now an Arabic city that Arabs lived there. I think the Kuwaiti government must answer the question. The Kuwaiti government must give us questions. What the Turkish also, of course, the Turkish are responsible as occupier. This is under, it's illegal. They changed the demographic status of Afrin. Unfortunately, the Kurds are very weak, and their voice is not heard by the international community. I urge you, all of the panelists, to begin to investigate and to shed light.
So in this talk, I would like to explore the ways, with my anthropologist hat, in which law, political culture, and foreign and security policy have intersected in Turkey's Syria policy to shape Ankara's demographic engineering attempts through settlement and displacement practices in northern Syria. To help uncover the cultural logic that drives the Turkish government's perceptions and policy responses, I will combine insights from legal anthropology, history, political science, and international relations to examine the processes through which demography and belonging have become securitized in this case. Overall, Turkey's demographic engineering practices in Syria have been intricately connected to the significant change in Ankara's objectives in Syria since the beginning of the civil war in 2011. The Erdogan government's initial plans to topple the Bashar al-Assad regime and replace it with a Muslim Brotherhood-led government under Ankara's tutelage gave way to a focus on preventing the emergence of an autonomous Kurdish statelet on Turkey's southern border. This change was brought about by Assad's cunning move to withdraw regime forces from the Kurdish majority areas in the country's north in 2012, allowing Syrian Kurdish Democratic Union Party, namely the PYD, to control and run the region. This development toward a de facto form of Kurdish self-rule by a political group that Ankara sees as an offshoot of the terrorist-designated Kurdistan Workers' Party, namely the PKK, led to a transition in Erdogan government's policies from regime change in Syria to regime defense back at home in Turkey. Turkey's ensuing military operations into northern Syria and the accompanying forced displacement and settlement policies in the region, however, are not solely about denying territorial control to the PYD's military wing, the People's Protection Forces, namely the YPG, and thereby strategic depth to the PKK. For Ankara, the greater threat remains the idea of Kurdish autonomy or self-rule. Hence, after taking over Afrin, for example, Turkish forces tore down a statue linked to Kurdish culture, renamed streets and public places to replace Kurdish words, and suppressed Kurdish language and identity. Ankara's forced displacement of Kurds, both Muslims and Yazidis, and resettlement of Syrian Arabs and other political allies, including non-Syrian members of Turkey-backed proxy fighters from other regions, fit into a broader strategy of preventing a viable Kurdish entity across Turkey's borders. Demographic engineering has long been a central feature of Turkish statecraft, which not only precedes the rule of Turkey's Islamist-rooted Justice and Development Party, namely the AKP, in power since 2002, but also precedes the Republic of Turkey, established in 1923. In fact, forced displacement and resettlement of ethno-religious groups were central also to the Ottoman statecraft in terms of both securing new territories following conquests and maintaining rule and order in the empire's core territories. Such a technology of rule was not restricted to the arbitrary nature of rule associated with the patrimonialism of the Ottoman sultans. The increasingly bureaucratized security apparatus of Abdülhamit II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, and the rule of the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, that toppled Abdülhamit II's absolutism, were in fact equally brutal in their securitization of demographic issues. Both periods, namely the Abdülhamit II period and the Committee of Union and Progress periods, were marked with state-led pogroms and massacres, forced displacement, and resettlement policies driven by perceived existential threats to the milleti hakime, the dominant or ruling community, namely the Turks, the Muslim Turks, Sunni Muslim Turks. In fact, the codification of a Turkish and Sunni Muslim privileged in-group, first as the milleti hakime, the dominant group, and then as asli unsur, the fundamental element, in political legal practice, picked up steam with the CUP and continued under the Republican rule. Despite the reported breaks in between these periods, the continuities in the security discourse and practice point to an underlying political-cultural logic that has permeated the Turkish bureaucracies, especially the security bureaucracies, perceptions and policies to this day. Although much of the controversy on Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which states the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civil population into the territory it occupies, stems from the definition of the concept of civilian population. When it comes to the Turkish case, I would argue that it's also crucial to focus on the attribute own. In many of the cases involving settlement in occupied territories around the world, the settled groups are citizens of the occupying power. Although the concept of citizenship is clearly defined in the Turkish legal system, Ankara's official discourses and practices concerning citizenship point to a more fluid and complex relationship that requires a closer scrutiny of the implications of the concept of, quote, own civilian population, end quote. The first complication arises from the fact that, for Ankara, certain categories of Turkish citizens are lesser citizens, while other categories of non-citizens can be perceived as more essentially belonging to the nation, and hence more fitting of the attribute own. In 2005, for example, then Secretary General of Turkey's Chief of the General Staff issued a press release condemning the attempts to burn the Turkish flag during Nowruz celebrations or Nevroz celebrations in Mersin, in Turkey's Mediterranean coast province of Mersin, referring to the individuals, mostly pro-Kurdish individuals involved, as sözde kendi vatandaşları, the so-called own citizens of Turkey. In fact, over the years, Turkey has even revoked the citizenship of its own nationals, not only rhetorically by calling them so-called citizens, but also legally, especially for political quote-unquote crimes, including the citizenship of the world-renowned poet Nazım Hikmet, who lost his citizenship as of 1959, and the citizenship was restituted only under the AKP rule. While it is quick and easy for Ankara to disown a citizen, it could be equally quick and easy for foreign nationals to be embraced as Turkey's very own through fast-track citizenship procedures. While the Turkish government has branded many Syrian Kurds as terrorists, other Syrians, especially Sunni Muslim Syrians, aligned with Ankara's foreign and security policy priorities, have been rewarded with citizenship, including, as reported last year, 8 members of the Islamic State. So even that would not preclude one from gaining fast-track citizenship. To complicate matters further, Turkey also offers an immediate citizenship program for foreign nationals who are willing to acquire real estate worth $250,000 and commit to holding it for 3 years. various private agencies, for example, promote this program by promising the delivery of a Turkish passport in less than 2 months. When it comes to northern Syria, another complicating factor concerning citizenship is the reported cases of what one could call as transhuman proxy leaders and fighters, who travel back and forth between their Turkey and Syria-based residences and receive not only Turkish pay for their services, but also at times Turkish citizenship. So these are basically, to clarify, these are Syrian proxy fighters, especially the leadership circle, who earn their living serving as proxy fighters, who might have been rewarded with a Turkish citizenship, who part of the year live in Turkey, even in the Western Turkish provinces, living a lavish life, and spend the other part of the year in Syria fighting on behalf of Turkey. In the Erdogan government's perspective, these Syrian proxies, some of whom also have Turkish citizenship, are again more loyal members of the Turkish nation compared to other Turkish citizens whose ethnicity, religion, and or political views relegate them to a lesser category of membership in the Turkish polity. For all these complex reasons, for Ankara, some of the Syrian Arabs, as well as foreign fighters Turkey settled in northern Syria from other countries, could be perceived as belonging to the Turkish nation more than many of Turkey's own citizens perceived as undesirable elements. For example, when the Turkish government chose to build camps for displaced Syrians in Turkey's southeastern province of Kahramanmaraş, 4 of the 6 camps were placed in the vicinity of indigenous Alevi settlements, a religious minority, and indigenous religious minority settlements, which the local Alevis protested as an attempt to assimilate or displace Alevi citizens by bringing in Sunni Arab settlers from Syria. Across the Syrian border, the settlement of Sunni Arab settlers in Kurdish majority areas has been driven by a similarly securitized demographic policy that sees undesirable ethnic, religious, and political identities as existential threats to be dealt with through policies of demographic engineering. One could argue that in both of these demographic engineering projects, to the north and south of the Turkish-Syrian border, Ankara sees the settlers it brings as its very own, as opposed to the indigenous groups, even when they happen to be Turkish citizens, as in the case of the Turkish and Kurdish Alevis in the province of Kahramanmaraş. Similar attempts to dilute threats were also evident in Ankara's earlier settlement policies elsewhere. The Ottoman settlement of displaced Circassians pushed out by Imperial Russia as loyal subjects in unruly Kurdish majority areas, unruly in quotes, and the Turkish government settlement of Sunni Muslim Meskhetian Turks, again displaced by Stalin's Russia, again in sensitive border regions with Shiite Turkish and Sunni Kurdish populations, such as the province of Iğdır bordering Armenia, Iran, and the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic, were driven by similar security concerns. Similarly, the settlement of Turkish citizens in northern Cyprus to dilute the voter base of Cypriot Turks, indigenous Cypriot Turks, whose political, religious, and cultural characteristics Ankara has historically found untrustworthy, points to the same cultural logic applied beyond Turkey's borders. All of these cases point to a recurrent pattern where law, political culture, and foreign and security policy have intersected in sui generis ways during the Ottoman and Republican periods. Thus, any attempt to make sense of Turkey's policies and practices under the Fourth Geneva Convention requires paying attention to the idiosyncratic ways in which law and politics are refracted through the lens of Turkish statecraft and its exclusionary and supremacist ethno-religious tenets rooted mainly in late Ottoman and early Republican anxieties and practices. Thank you.
My perspective on Turkish population transfers in northern Syria has, I think, both micro and a macro component. On the micro level, I think Turkish actions may violate one or more provisions from Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. On the macro, I think the lack of much in the way of international scrutiny or criticism for what Turkey has done and is doing in Syria suggests a hollowness of what we want to think of as robust international humanitarian law. And just switching gears, just for some context, I wonder if what is happening now in Ukraine and what eventually happens in terms of accountability measures there will inform the scope of what I see as this hollowness problem. So turning to Article 49, which first speaker and Ariel have just touched on. So under Common Article 2 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, I think we should just be clear at the outset, the conventions apply to Turkey's partial occupation of Syrian territory. And the most relevant aspects of the conventions are in the Fourth Convention, which regulates occupation. And Syrian territory is appropriately considered occupied since it came under the effective control or authority of the Turkish armed forces without Syrian consent. As Human Rights Watch has reported, Turkey treats the areas it occupies as essentially part of Turkey. Public statements from Turkish state news agencies have claimed that Turkish governmental departments coordinate for and provide public services, including water, garbage collection, cleaning, healthcare services, and humanitarian aid, all in the occupied area. Now, Turkey does not, to my knowledge, acknowledge this occupation, instead claiming to have only created a security buffer. That Turkey does not acknowledge occupation is legally irrelevant. It is a factual determination that has clearly been met. And while I, of course, have no knowledge of the International Committee of the Red Cross and Crescent's confidential dialogue with the Turkish government, the ICRC has no doubt sent Turkey rappel de droit, reminding Turkey of the applicable law. In terms of Turkish population transfers, as was just discussed, Article 49 of the Fourth Convention is implicated. And just to take a step back, I'd say my focus is on Article 49 writ large and not just Article 49.6. So Article 49 addresses deportations, transfers, and evacuations, all of which are either occurring or have occurred. To my knowledge, or to my sense, I think potentially the most problematic aspect may actually be Article 49.1, which prohibits Turkey from individual or mass forcible transfers as well as deportations of protected persons from Syria to Turkey. And I say potentially the most problematic because 49.1 is the only portion of Article 49 to qualify as a grave breach or serious violation of the Geneva Conventions. And as I'll discuss in a moment, that it's a grave breach triggers or should trigger action by the international community. According to Human Rights Watch, Turkey has forcibly transferred at least 63 and as many as 200 Syrians from occupied territory to Turkey. If true, each one of the transfers is a serious violation or grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. Switching to Article 49.2, that provision prohibits the forcible evacuation of protected persons absent imperative security or safety concerns. It would appear that Turkey has directly or indirectly effectuated the evacuation of particularly Kurds, but also Yazidi and others from northern Syria. And while perhaps imperative security or safety concerns have been implicated at some time, I think it's important to recognize Article 49.2 also requires that, quote, persons thus evacuated shall be transferred back to their homes as soon as hostilities in the area in question have ceased. And Turkey has not only not returned those evacuated to their homes, but instead has moved others into those homes. Shifting to Article 49.6 and touching on, Ariel's point just a moment ago, as has been discussed, Turkey has relocated thousands of individuals from Turkey into occupied territory in Syria. And this does seem to implicate 49.6. And I am curious as to my fellow panelists and Ariel and those in attendance view, but Article 49.6 prohibits Turkey from deporting or transferring part of its own civilian population. And what exactly is meant by that civilian population is obviously an important question. When I look at the ICRC's commentary to Article 49.6, it suggests that civilian population means national of the occupying state. So it is not clear to me that Syria moving non-Syrian nationals into occupied territory violates 49.6, but I'm curious as to my fellow panelists' view. I wonder if that is just something that was not contemplated during the negotiations for the Geneva Conventions. And I note the fourth convention is the last for the ICRC's updated commentaries project. So if and maybe how the commentary to 49.6 changes is something maybe to look out for. Shifting to the macro, what does it say about international humanitarian law and the international community that Turkish actions are receiving such little attention or scrutiny? As I previously mentioned, occupation is a factual determination. This is to moot verbal obfuscation like Turkey's claim of a security buffer. I can't help but wonder if the international community's tacit acceptance of Turkey's label in some way informed Russia's current claim of its special military operation in Ukraine. It's also interesting to see that Russia appears to have violated Article 49 by forcibly transferring Ukrainians to Russia. Why is that receiving so much more attention than Turkey's actions? It's particularly hard to understand given the numbers of people transferred to Turkey or evacuated within Syria are far greater than the numbers of Ukrainians allegedly transferred to Russia. In terms of why there hasn't been much attention on Turkish actions, I wonder the extent that ethnicity, race, and national origin factor in, but I leave those issues to others far better qualified than I. But I'll end with a depressing legal observation, or perhaps realization. I've long thought, or at least perhaps wanted to believe, that the grave breach regime of the 1949 Geneva Conventions was a significant addition, and that it served as the foundation of what international criminal law has become. But in applying any real scrutiny to the grave breach provisions, they seem hollow. Every country in the world agreed to enact legislation to provide effective penal sanctions for persons committing or ordering to be committed any of the grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. So this would implicate Article 49.1. Additionally, every country in the world is under the legal obligation to search for persons alleged to have committed or to have ordered to be committed grave breaches, and shall bring such persons, regardless of their nationality, before its own courts. Very few countries have enacted that required legislation, and fewer countries still have acted in support of the search for and prosecute offenders provisions. I wonder the extent by which that collective failure partially explains the collective silence towards Turkey. To paraphrase a Bible verse, in terms of international accountability and justice, the answer to the question, whom shall I send and who will go for us, should be from every country in the world, here I am, send me. Instead, the answer, at least in part, is to look away, to play ostrich, and to stick our collective heads in the sand. I think the continued failing of the international community to fulfill their obligations stemming from the 1949 Geneva Conventions emboldens Turkey to take the actions it has. And potentially worse, there not being negative consequences for Turkey, risks encouraging other states. Thank you.
49(6). Such a prohibition did not seem to appear in international humanitarian law before the Fourth Geneva Conventions. And the drafting background of it is fairly brief but fairly pointed. The countries negotiating the Geneva Conventions seemed inspired to include this, according to the protocols, by the German population transfers during World War II, which largely consisted of transferring ethnic German, or those who qualified as sufficiently German by very complicated criteria, into occupied areas of Eastern Europe, in particular Poland and Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. Importantly, this was a 1-2 punch. This did not just consist of moving ethnic Germans in, where they would probably not fare well, but also simultaneously and primarily removing and transferring out the local population. And this is what the rest of the first subparagraphs of Article 49 deal with, the displacement of the local population, and the 1-2 punch makes the demographic change particularly effective. Now, fairly little research, as far as I know, has been done on the particular historical circumstances of this German transfer, to the extent that they might guide our understanding of Article 49(6). For example, did this only include German citizens? Did it include what were known as Volga Germans, or ethnic Germans who had been living in the Soviet Union? Were they part of this resettlement project? All of that could inform our understanding of this position. But more broadly, there are really two ways of thinking about 49(6), I think, which I would describe as the narrow textual or the broad purpose-based interpretive approaches. Now, from a purely textual approach, Article 49(6) does not cover all or many kinds of transfers. For example, the civilian population, the requirement that it be the civilian population of the occupying power, what does that include? As Professor Jenks mentioned, does that mean they have to be their own nationals, potentially? What does deportation or transfer mean, right? Does that require some specific kind of organized movement? Do projects financed by Kuwaiti or Israeli Arab organizations count as, can they be ascribed to the Turkish government for these purposes? What level of organization by the government is needed? These are all questions, and the words deportation or transfer really don't speak to themselves. Furthermore, the provision says part of its civilian population. In other contexts, and then the reference part of the population might mean a sizable part. What's the amount? So all of these questions arise, and I think are unclear textually. There's another approach, which is based on what are thought to be the policies of 49(6), and this approach interprets it quite broadly to cover really any kind of change in the status quo in the occupied territory, especially any kind of permanent change, with a real focus on protecting the rights and self-determination of the protected population in the occupied territory, i.e. the locals, often Kurds in the case in question. And there is a specific mode of interpreting Article 49(6). Professor Benvenisti and others are known to take this interpretation, that it really needs to be interpreted broadly because it's for the benefit, for the protection of the local population, in which case all of these details might fall away, and you'd say, is it good for the Kurds? Probably not, and that would be all that matters. So I don't have an answer to those interpretive difficulties, to those interpretive questions. I think they're unclear, but but clearly from the purposive point of interpretation, what is happening clearly seems to fit the bill. In particular, especially given the circumstances of what seems to be the significant level of Turkish government organization and indeed public ownership of this. Right, Turkey publicly announced several years ago they have this broad plan to move hundreds of thousands of actually people from within their borders to these areas in Turkey. So that is a fairly high level of government organization and indeed public sponsorship. Indeed, in some cases, we may not even have to think about the technical meaning of the phrase deportation or transfer, because to the extent that many of these people are indeed refugees, they may be said to be deported in the conventional sense. Right? Turkey is apparently using this for two purposes: to change the demographics in occupied Syria, but also to remove undesired refugee population from within its own borders. So clearly, in that view, it would be a problem under Article 49.6. A narrow view, though, might of course have something else to say. But here we get to international legal methodology, and as a positivist, someone who thinks we can learn the law not just from what we think should be, but from we're obliged to learn it from what is. Indeed, in international law, what states do is a primary way of learning international law, of interpreting the meaning of treaties the countries agree to, is state practice in the absence of adjudicatory bodies with compulsory jurisdiction and so forth. So you can't try to understand international law without looking at state practice, or at least having some interpretation that's heavily informed by what actually happens. And here we get to the point made by Professor Jenks and several previous panelists. It is hard to find a government, a country, that has publicly condemned this as a violation of Article 49.6. It is hard to find an international organization, a UN body, or even internationally based humanitarian organization that has condemned this as a violation of Article 49.6, or really anyone other than local Syrian Kurdish human rights monitors. So in the absence of such a reaction, that has to say something. You have to acknowledge that somehow. And just briefly, I want to say parenthetically, we can't say, well, that's just politics, right? Oh, countries aren't saying anything because it's just politics. There's a lot of countries in the world. They're not all aligned with Turkey politically. You may think some of them may be hostile to Turkey, and indeed for them, this would be an opportunity. UN bodies are supposed to be focused on international law, international rights, and really be above this kind of thing. And there's a lot of them to choose from. Same with international humanitarian groups like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. So the lack of a clear labeling of this as a 49.6 violation by them, I think, requires at least some kind of pause, because it either means, and Professor Jenks may be right, there's just a hollowness here, right? It could mean the entire world, is wrong or acting inappropriately, but that's a sad conclusion to draw for international law, because then you just kind of give up. Or perhaps it might make us think maybe there's a reason, right? Maybe there's something about this that makes it not an obvious Article 49.6 case. And I'm not saying this is the clear legal analysis of any particular body, but maybe this helps explain the lack of any kind of a violation. And here I want to pick up on a point made by Dr. Muller about not blaming the victims or the co-victims, that is to say the Arab refugees from Syria who are being transferred by the Turkish government, and I want to put that in a kind of legal terminology. So we see Professor Jenks mentioned, and I previously referred to, first of all, what is the definition of civilian population? That's not obvious. We can discuss that in questions, but maybe even aside from what constitutes the civilian population of a country. So it could mean nationals, right? But on the other hand, you could also, I think another credible interpretation could be the people who are living and residing in the country. And clearly these refugees are residing in Turkey, and they've been residing in Turkey for many years, 8 or 10 in some cases. So maybe exactly the issue is that they are refugees, right? And maybe it's exactly because they are refugees, and there is some humanitarian duty to settle refugees. It could be, and this is an idea, this is something I've written about previously, it could be that maybe when Article 49.6 talks about transfer, it's not, maybe refugees, are not what it's talking about. Maybe refugees can't be settlers themselves, and maybe, there's something in things in international practice to confirm that. So, for example, Armenia has encouraged and facilitated the movement of some tens of thousands of people into Nagorno-Karabakh, which it occupies parts of, which it occupied more until last year's war with Azerbaijan, which is a lot of people by Nagorno-Karabakh standards. And the international community has not called this an Article 49.6 violation, though clearly maintaining that Nagorno-Karabakh is occupied Azerbaijani territory. So perhaps that is because many of the people who were resettled there were Armenians who fled Azerbaijan during the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, just like many Azeris fled Armenian territory for Azerbaijan. So maybe because these are refugees who are being settled, that's a special circumstance. And there's been a recent practice that I think I can't not mention in this panel, involving both Karabakh and Russian-occupied Abkhazia and Ossetia. In the case of Karabakh and Abkhazia, Armenia and the Russian occupation forces, respectively, have been, while looking for people to move there, and it's hard to find people to move there, simply because I think, political issues aside, these are areas of sort of net migration. People are generally not looking to move there. So who wants to move to Abkhazia or Karabakh? One answer the administrating governments have found is Armenian or Abkhazian refugees from Syria, exactly because the civil war disturbed the life of all minorities in everyone. In Syria, minorities became particularly vulnerable, and Armenians were often displaced into these areas from Armenia 100 years ago by Turkey, could find moving to Karabakh an attractive proposition relative to remaining in the Syrian civil war. And some of these groups have indeed been very explicitly resettled by Armenia, by the Abkhazian administration, with clear financial incentives. No one has described this an Article 49.6 violation, and because these people were refugees, right? The Armenians fleeing Syria were clearly refugees, and so forth. So maybe that is one way to understand this. Then there is the question of just international attention. If Turkish settlement policy in northern Cyprus does not get UN condemnation, and it's an EU member and is not being investigated by the ICC, and Cyprus is a founding member of the ICC, all the more so for the northern Syria, which is not an EU member and is not part of the part of the ICC. And then so I'll add just on the note for all of you who stay tuned this long, what everyone really wants to hear about, which is Russia and Ukraine. Russia has apparently settled hundreds of thousands, at least 100,000 Russians, or hundreds of thousands of Russians have moved from Russia into Crimea since 2014. And the ICC, while investigating Russian war crimes in Crimea and coming up with a fairly long list to suggest for full investigation, dropped or omitted this population movement from the list of things it will be investigating. And so what that might suggest, so that would certainly suggest to Turkey there's a green light. And what, taking all of this together might suggest is, that there's as Professor Jenks said, a deep dysfunction in the international community's legal rhetoric around this prohibition. After decades, it may be said to have fallen into some kind of desuetude, except for its notable application to Israel, but it seems to have really little traction in dealing with most ongoing occupation situations. And I agree with Professor Jenks. It's going to be very interesting to see if the current Russo-Ukrainian war changes, for example, the ICC's rhetoric. The ICC is a legal body. It is supposed to talk about legal things. Whether they will rediscover population transfer in Crimea or not. I'm saying 70-30 not. I'll give 2-to-1 odds on not, but it's not impossible. And thank you. So I have to start somewhere, and I think this is the first discussion of an important issue, which hopefully will get more of an airing in broader international fora. One of the things I think everyone discussed is why this issue doesn't get more interest, and of course, the difficulty in attracting more interest in it is that there seems to be a concerted decision not to be interested. So it's a bit of a circular problem. Hopefully, we're going to provide some material to change that. And I want to echo Ariel and encourage all of our wonderful commentators to deepen and continue scholarship on this issue, because there's certainly a lack of published work. I want to thank our audience, and again, thank you to all the panelists, Ariel and Sally, for excellent work putting this together, and good evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.